All right, let's dive into a topic that's ripe with misconceptions. Victorian sexuality. We all kind of have this image, right, of like the buttoned-up Victorians, all about repression.
Right.
But I have a feeling it's way more complicated than that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Victorian era, especially when we think about England, it's like the poster child for sexual repression.
Right.
But as we'll see, the truth is much more, well, interesting. And our source material today really digs into this, this whole world of Victorian sexuality.
Okay, so let's set the stage. We're talking early 1800s England. What's the social climate like?
Well, you've got, on the one hand, the aristocracy, right? The upper crust, living pretty extravagantly, lots of, shall we say, discreet affairs, that kind of thing.
Not exactly the image of restraint we associate with the Victorian.
No, not exactly. But at the same time, you have this other movement gaining traction, the evangelicals.
Okay.
And they were all about piety, hard work, and definitely chastity. So you can imagine they saw the aristocracy as, well, a little too free-spirited for their liking.
So you've got this real clash of values playing out.
Exactly. And right in the middle of it all, you have young Queen Victoria taking the throne.
Victoria, she's such an iconic figure.
Right. And her advisors, they were really keen on cleaning up the monarchy's image, so to speak.
I bet. After the scandals of her uncles and all that.
Exactly. So they saw Victoria, this young queen who hadn't been caught up in all of that, as a chance for a fresh start.
So they basically reinvented her image.
In a way, yes. They played up her youth, her supposed innocence. She became this symbol of morality, of restraint.
Did it work? Did people buy it?
Oh, totally. Victoria became hugely popular, but whether that image really captured the whole story is another question.
Ooh, okay. There's more to her than meets the eye.
Let's just say Victoria had a zest for life, loved the theater, music, dancing. She wanted to experience it all. And that brings us to a rather important figure in her life, Lord Melbourne.
Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister. The documentary definitely hinted that they were close.
Close. They spent hours together every day. He was this older, charming, witty guy, and he just loved regaling her with stories.
What kind of stories?
Oh, juicy gossip from high society, scandals, affairs, you name it.
Sounds a little scandalous in itself, given the whole image of the court.
Oh, people definitely talked. But then something happened that really solidified Victoria's image as this beacon of morality. The Lady Flora Hastings scandal.
Okay. Who was Lady Flora Hastings?
She was a young woman who, she served in the Queen's household, and unfortunately she developed this stomach ailment, caused a lot of swelling.
Oh, no. I can already see where this is going.
Right. Well, you know how it is. Rumors started flying. And because appearances were everything in court, those rumors quickly turned into accusations.
Accusations of what?
That she was pregnant. Out of wedlock, of course.
Oh, my gosh.
And the worst part, even Victoria became convinced it was true.
Wow. I mean, talk about pressure to be morally perfect.
Exactly. Victoria felt like she had to address it, given her image.
So what happened?
Well, poor Lady Flora, she agreed to this, humiliating medical examination to try to clear her name.
Oh, how awful.
It was. And you know what? The doctor confirmed she was, in fact, a virgin.
So it was all completely untrue.
Completely. But sadly, the damage was done.
I bet.
Shortly after that whole ordeal, Lady Flora, she passed away.
Oh, that's just tragic.
It was. And the truly sad part is she didn't die from a scandalous pregnancy. It was the stomach tumor, the one that had been misdiagnosed all along. It really puts into perspective the impossible standards that were placed on women, even those in positions of power during that time.
It's heartbreaking, really. But even with all that surrounding her, Victoria did eventually find love and marry, right?
She did, and her marriage to Prince Albert became quite the event.
I bet. It wasn't just a love story, it was a major political move too, wasn't it?
Absolutely. A suitable husband would, quiet down those Melbourne rumors, and a royal wedding. Always good for the monarchy's image.
2 birds, 1 stone.
Mm-hmm.
But was Victoria on board with all this matchmaking, or was it more of a strategic decision for the crown?
Well, initially she was hesitant about marriage,
Really? I wouldn't expect that from a queen.
It makes sense, though, right? She'd finally carved out this independent role for herself.
That's true. She didn't want to give up her power.
Exactly. But then she met Albert, and, that changed everything.
It was love at first sight.
From her perspective, absolutely. She was smitten.
He must have been quite something to sweep a queen off her feet.
Oh, he was charming, handsome, and by all accounts, really intelligent. Definitely a good catch.
So how did their private life, as a couple, measure up to the whole image of the perfect Victorian marriage?
Publicly, they were the epitome of respectability, right? Restrained, proper, focused on family. But Victoria's diaries tell a different story.
Juicy.
They were very much in love, very passionate, a stark contrast to the image they presented to the world.
It's always interesting to see what goes on behind closed doors. Speaking of which, what about intimacy within marriage? During the Victorian era, was that seen as, part of this whole respectability thing?
It was more about duty, specifically, the duty to procreate.
Ah, so not so much about pleasure then.
Not exactly. Contraception, as we know it, didn't really exist, at least not in a way that was socially acceptable.
Right.
Condoms were around, but they were mostly seen as protection against diseases.
Interesting. So large families were the norm then.
Pretty much. And it's interesting because despite having 9 children with Albert, Victoria actually found pregnancy and childbirth really tough.
9? Wow. I can see why she might not have loved that whole duty aspect of marriage.
Right, but Victoria and Albert, they represent just one side of the story. There were plenty of people who didn't fit this ideal mold, whose lives were much more complicated.
And the documentary highlighted that, didn't it? It showed us what happened when those Victorian ideals clashed with reality.
Exactly, and a prime example of that is Caroline Norton.
Caroline Norton. Remind me, what was her story?
She was married to this guy, George Norton, and it was a nightmare. Years of abuse.
Abuse? Like what?
We're talking physical violence, even while she was pregnant, which tragically led to a miscarriage.
Oh, God.
There were accounts of him burning her with boiling water.
That's horrific. How could she escape that? Wasn't divorce an option?
Not really. Divorce in Victorian England, incredibly difficult, especially for women.
How so?
It required an act of parliament.
An act of parliament, just to get a divorce.
Just imagine the cost, the time. It was basically impossible for most people.
So if you were a woman stuck in a bad marriage with no money of your own...
You were trapped. And in Caroline's case, to make matters worse, her husband accused her of adultery with, wait for it, Lord Melbourne.
Lord Melbourne again. What was the basis for that accusation?
Caroline, she craved intellectual companionship. Her husband was,
Right.
So she and Melbourne, they'd spend time together talking politics, literature, that kind of thing.
So it was innocent enough?
It was. But people saw them together, and the rumors started flying.
Classic Victorian gossip.
Exactly. And her husband, he saw a way to use it to his advantage. He decided to sue Lord Melbourne under this crazy law called criminal conversation.
Criminal conversation. That sounds intense. What is that?
Basically, a husband could sue his wife's supposed lover for damages, for the loss of his wife's services.
Oh, my God. So basically profiting off your wife's alleged infidelity.
Pretty much. It just shows how women were seen as property back then.
So did this case actually go to court?
Oh, it blew up, became a huge scandal. But in the end, there was no evidence of adultery.
So Caroline was in the clear.
Legally, yes, but her reputation ruined. She was labeled a fallen woman, ostracized.
Even though she was innocent.
Even though she was innocent. And that just goes to show how powerful social expectations were back then. But even with all that, some people still dare to challenge the status quo. Consequences be damned.
And that's where Marion Evans comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
The writer who used the pen name George Eliot.
Yes. She's a fascinating character. Completely rejected her strict upbringing, embraced intellectual freedom, even though it meant going against societal norms.
What'd she do?
She moved to London by herself, which was a huge deal at the time, especially for a woman.
Wow. Bold move.
Right. And she dove headfirst into this whole world of literature and radical thinking. She even became the co-editor of a journal called The Westminster Review.
Wait, a woman editing a radical journal in Victorian England?
It was practically unheard of. She had to keep her involvement a secret, or she would have been shunned by society.
It's amazing, though, how she found a way to make her voice heard.
She was brilliant, and she refused to be silenced. But of course, her story also involves a scandal.
Of course it does. What happened?
She fell in love with a man named George Lewes, a writer, a philosopher, very prominent in his field.
Okay, so another writer. Sounds like a good match.
Except for one tiny detail. Lewis was already married.
Oh, no. Another scandal brewing.
And it gets even juicier. Not only did they fall in love, but they decided to live together. Openly. As husband and wife.
So they were basically living in sin in the eyes of Victorian society.
Exactly. And you can imagine how well that went down.
Not, well, I'm guessing. Did they face any consequences for their relationship?
Oh, absolutely. Marion Evans, she was branded a fallen woman. shunned by many of her former friends.
It's amazing how quickly people could turn on you just for living your life the way you wanted to.
It's a reminder that these Victorian ideals, they were powerful, deeply ingrained in society.
Even more so when you consider that this is all happening while Victoria and Albert are still being held up as the perfect couple.
Right. And speaking of Victoria, even she wasn't immune to scandal.
You're talking about John Brown, right? The documentary mentioned a bit about him, but I'd love to hear more.
John Brown, now there's a figure who really stirred things up.
He was a servant in the royal household, wasn't he?
He was. And after Albert's death, Victoria, well, she found solace in their relationship.
Their relationship. It was more than just friendship.
It was a very close bond, and it definitely raised eyebrows.
I can only imagine. He was a commoner, right? Quite a change from Prince Albert.
He was the complete opposite of Albert. Rough around the edges, no real social graces.
So what was it about him that appealed to Victoria?
Well, he was fiercely loyal, very protective. And unlike most people in her circle, he wasn't afraid to challenge her.
I guess after years of people constantly deferring to her, that must have been kind of refreshing.
Right. And let's not forget, she was grieving, still carrying the weight of the monarchy on her shoulders. John Brown probably offered a sense of normalcy, of escape.
It makes sense, but it didn't exactly go unnoticed, did it? The rumors must have been swirling.
Oh, they were relentless. Some whispered that they were secretly married, even that Victoria had his child.
Wow. A secret marriage? A child? It seems like even a queen couldn't escape the rumor mill.
Exactly. It shows you that even as these idealized images of marriage and morality persisted, the reality was much more complicated.
Definitely. And those cracks started showing in other areas too, right? Like with the divorce laws.
Yeah.
You said earlier that it was almost impossible to get a divorce in Victorian England.
It was, but that started to change, thanks in part to people like Caroline Norton. Remember, she'd experienced the injustice of the system firsthand.
Right, she couldn't get away from her abusive husband because of those laws.
Exactly. And she became a vocal advocate for reform. And finally, in 1857, Parliament passed a new divorce law.
About time. What did the new law change?
Well, it didn't make it easy, but it at least made divorce a possibility for more people.
So no longer an act of Parliament required.
No. It was still expensive, still a long process, but it was a step in the right direction.
A step toward acknowledging that people shouldn't be trapped in miserable marriages, even in Victorian England.
Exactly. It showed a growing awareness of individual happiness, which was a pretty big deal back then.
It really makes you think about how much things have changed. So, speaking of change, what happened to Caroline Norton and Marion Evans? Did they ever find happiness after all the scandals?
You know, it's interesting. Caroline, after her husband died, she actually did remarry.
She did. Good for her.
She found someone new and finally got that respectability that had been denied to her for so long. And Marion Evans, she also remarried, though much later in life after George Lewes passed away.
So even though they both challenged those Victorian norms, they ended up back within the system they'd rebelled against.
It's a bit ironic, isn't it? Shows how powerful those societal pressures really were, even on people who actively fought against them. But I think that's what makes this whole era so fascinating.
It is. It's like peeking behind the curtain, seeing the reality behind the image.
Exactly. Because when you look closer at the Victorians, you realize they weren't so different from us, you know? They had their desires, their secrets, their scandals.
And their contradictions. We've covered a lot of ground today. Love, marriage, scandal, societal change. It's amazing how much we can learn from history, even from an era as seemingly buttoned up as the Victorian era.
Right. It teaches us that things aren't always what they seem on the surface, and it makes you wonder, what will people in the future think when they look back at our time?
That's a great question. What will be the scandals, the contradictions that define us? Well, that's something to ponder. But for now, we'll leave it there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Victorian sexuality. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.